The Ivory Coast is pushing back against a proposed U.S. ban on cocoa from the West African country. U.S. Senators Sherrod Brown and Ron Wyden called for a crackdown on the imported product last month, arguing that there is evidence the Ivory Coast relies on forced child labor to harvest cocoa. The Ivory Coast's First Lady and her cabinet opposed the ban in a meeting with members of a U.S. delegation this week. The Washington Post reported in June that more than 2 million children were engaged in the practice on West African cocoa farms. The story documented the lives of 12 child laborers. The reporting was cited by the senators in their proposed ban. For more on this, let's bring in Peter Whoriskey. He is a reporter for the Washington Post and has been following the story. Peter, thanks very much for being with us. Let's begin with the conditions on the farms. You had the chance to speak to some children. What did you learn? How did they end up on the farms?
Well, there's two different types of kids on the farm. Some of them are just kids that are working for their parents. They drop out of school. People are very poor. They drop out of school and they work. The people that we focused on were kids that have been trafficked into Ivory Coast from surrounding countries, Burkina Faso mostly. And these are kids who are living without their parents, are between 12 and 16 years old. They get brought in and they work all the time. They don't have their parents with them. They're living in huts in the woods. We saw the water that they drank. It was just like this cloudy stuff that they pulled out of the swamp. It's pretty dismal conditions for those kids.
Really heartbreaking to see those accounts. You mentioned in your reporting that for nearly 20 years, some of the world's largest chocolate companies were aware of how the cocoa industry relied on child labor. They have taken steps to end child labor, but their efforts weren't successful. Why has the industry struggled to eradicate this practice?
Well, they tell you that they struggled because it's a very difficult problem, and in many ways it is a difficult problem. You're not talking about, a certain small set of plantations where there might be cocoa farming that would be sort of easier to have some oversight on. This is there's millions of these, or hundreds of thousands of these farms. They tend to be very small, 5 to 10 acres. They're in the woods. A lot of the places you can't get there by car. You have to go through a little path in the woods, a little sandy path, and then there it is. So if you're trying to eradicate child labor, it's going to be difficult. On the other hand, there's people who say, look, the companies have had 20 years. These are multi-billion-dollar companies. The first thing that they could do is alleviate poverty in West Africa by paying a decent price for cocoa, and that's what the problem.
Well, you reported in June that the chocolate industry collects an estimated $103 billion annually and has spent more than $150 million over the last 18 years to address the issue of child labor. Have they done enough?
Obviously not. I mean, it's still, according to the Department of Labor, the U.S. Department of Labor funded a study a few years back, and those researchers found that there were 2 million kids working on West African cocoa farms. So it hasn't been enough, and I don't think most American consumers are comfortable with the idea of a kid trafficked in to pick their cocoa in their chocolate when they're eating their chocolate bar.
No. Well, as we mentioned, 2 senators are proposing an all-out ban of cocoa from the Ivory Coast. How is the country's First Lady pushing back?
Well, this is her position, and I think this is also the position of some of the chocolate companies, which is, hey, if you pull out of Ivory Coast, that's just going to hurt all the farmers, regardless of whether they have child laborers working for them. They're saying, like, work with us, we need help, and in fact, the countries themselves have tried to raise cocoa prices. On the other side, people are saying, look, these companies have had 20 years to fix it, and they haven't.
Yeah.
Now's the time to act.
Well, what is the Ivory Coast doing to address the issue?
Well, they have passed laws that have made child labor illegal. On the other hand, as the U.S. government has reported, they have 5 people in their child trafficking. I think it was about 5 to 10 people in their child trafficking unit. They're all based in the company's de facto capital of Abidjan, which is a several-hour drive from the cocoa farming area. So it's hard to see how that fairly low level of scrutiny is going to get the job done when there's millions of kids doing this.
It's a really sobering, eye-opening piece. Peter Whoriskey, thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you.